Kia ora. My name is Tanya Hyde. I am the Technical Director in our Civil Engineering team at Becker, and I look after the circular design part of our business. And today, as part of Engineering New Zealand's Climate Action Conversation, we're going to be presenting a circular economy presentation on shaping the future. So this is one of the last ones before Christmas. So hopefully we're going to get one more in, but don't worry, these will continue into next year. So we have today Debbie O'Byrne, so she will be presenting for us. She started her BA back about 10 years ago now, and that had a focus on the circular economy. And since then, she's been working in that field, but she's been bringing the theoretical pieces of what she's studied and bringing that and applying that to the practical. So she's got some really good solutions and ideas for how we actually put that in an engineering world. So part of the work that she's done over the last few years as well was working in Australia, where she developed one of the first circular economy policies and frameworks which aligned with the government direction at the time. And she was the lead for the circular economy for Lake Macquarie. So she joined Becker at the start of this year as a principal lead in our circular economy business, and has actually had a huge impact on our business about how we actually apply the circular economy principles to our projects. And part of that work that she's done with us as well is co-designing our circular design framework. So she'll be discussing that today. So if you can just drop any questions in the chat and we'll answer those at the end, but I'll hand you over to Debbie now. Thanks, Deb.
It's tēnā koutou katoa, no Debbie toka ingoa. Welcome everybody today. I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to talk about something that I'm really passionate about. So I'm going to do a little bit of an introduction to the circular economy, because unless you're Māori who generally think in circular ways, some of this material will be new to you. So I'm going to give you a general overview and then kind of step through some examples, some case studies, some ideas of what's happening out there in that broader field, in that circular economy space, and happy to answer any questions at the end. So the easiest way to explain what a circular economy is to compare to the economy we've got now, which is linear. So we're very comfortable with cradle to grave, waste to landfill. It's part of the narrative that we've, lived with for a long period of time. And single use, we're pretty comfortable with single use. We've had single use straws, single use cups. But what's really interesting to me is this notion that we now have single use washing machines and dishwashers. So things that in our parents' generation would not have been something that would be used for a few years and thrown away. They would have been repaired, they would have been looked after. We no longer really have that. So things that are expensive and use a lot of resources to manufacture have now become single use. A linear economy is also very comfortable with silos, and there's been a very laser focus on GDP for a long period of time, where that's really the hyper focus of how we measure the success of our economy and by default our society. So that's really what we're chasing. We're also very comfortable with short-term thinking. We're really pursuing short-term efficiency for a long period of time. And the downside to that is short-term efficiency leads to really short timescales for decision making. So we're used to quarterly reports, share prices, annual reports, and even our election cycles have become really short, 3 to 5 years in most cases. And when you're talking about long-term infrastructure, long-term decisions that impact multiple generations, that doesn't lend itself very well to that kind of thinking. We all know about fossil fuels and it being, that's what's powered our economy for the last few hundred years. So I'm not going to go into that in any great detail. We know the challenges that has presented. But the revenue model itself is part of the challenge in the circular economy, where if you're a successful business and you want to be more successful, that means throughput. Pushing more material through the system and then clipping the ticket for every widget or gadget that you sell. So that has the unintended consequences of using massive amount of natural materials in order to be more profitable as a business. The circular economy, on the other hand, is looking to design out waste. It's looking at more of that cradle to cradle approach. Imagine what a city would look like if there was no landfill, where that wasn't the option at the end of the life cycle of a material or even of our buildings. C&D waste presents huge amount of challenges globally. I think it's about 50% in New Zealand. So really, we want to get past this single use, and we want to cascade these materials and assets through multiple life cycles. And that's where designing out waste comes into the equation. Because if we don't start designing differently, we get in our own way down the line when we're trying to actually reuse those materials. We glue them together. We use chemicals and glues that make it really difficult to separate materials and reuse them again. And a circular economy is also looking beyond that, hyper focused on GDP and dollars, and taking more of a systems thinking approach. So looking at things like integrated reporting, which is the 6 capitals, not just financial capital, and the SDGs. We're certainly starting to see more appetite for conversations around DGs, particularly in Australia. Again, fossil fuels, we know that a circular economy must be built on renewable energy. And the revenue model itself and circular economy is about value and performance. And that creates a different business model for success. And I'm going to show you a couple of examples of those in some of the later slides. So what are the 3 key principles of a circular economy? One, we want to regenerate natural systems. We have, sustainability is, pretty much okay if you're happy with the status quo and you want to sustain it. But if you want to fix what we broke and regenerate the natural systems that have been massively disrupted, we need to go further. We need to deliberately find opportunities to regenerate natural systems in the way we do our work. We need to design out waste and pollution, a little bit what I spoke about earlier. We need to get to the front end of the design phase so that we can design that future waste out. I'm watching a building go up, likely go up here in Tauranga, where we've demolished an old building, and I'm really hoping that the buildings of the future are designed so that the end result of that isn't another wrecking ball in another 50, 60, 70 years, whenever that building is finished that useful life. And then we need to find ways to cascade these materials and assets through multiple cycles. So again, these are not separate pieces. They're all interrelated in the application of them in a project in particular. I also wanted to mention that, there's a lot happening in that a circular economy Te Māori space. Like I said earlier, Indigenous communities often think intergenerationally, they think in systems, they think in much broader consideration, and their timeframes are, kind of put us to shame. I had a conversation with a friend of mine from Naitahu, and they're talking 500 years. So when you're developing assets for that time scale, it completely flips your thinking on its head. And I think that's something that we could really, really learn from, that Indigenous perspective, and how we bring their depth of knowledge and their worldviews into how the circular economy might look in New Zealand. And I think the circular economy in New Zealand could look quite different to anywhere else in the world. And I think that's a huge strength that we should be drawing upon. So there's lots happening in that space. And I'm really keen to see the Te Māori perspective and the circular economy perspective stay really closely aligned in the work that I do here at Becca. Just wanted to show you this sustainability maturity matrix for those of you who are not familiar with it. We're starting to see that push towards the restorative and regenerative. So systems thinking, natural systems, even we're starting to see nature-based design, biophilic, they would sit more on that regenerative end of the scale. And it's becoming, certainly in certain parts of the world, particularly the EU, it's an indication of sustainability maturity to demonstrate where you are at that spectrum. And that means there's an opportunity for New Zealand to leapfrog. Europe has been doing the circular economy work for more than a decade, 15 years. So they will have made some mistakes that we can learn from. So although we're a little bit behind, it presents a leapfrog opportunity to go to where best in class is. This is just a snapshot of some of the things that are underway. I'm not going to go into this in any great detail. It's really just to show them and demonstrate the momentum behind this shift. It's happening at a sector level, regional, national, international, and then we're looking at things like skill gaps, jobs and skills required in this transition to the circular economy. And I guess just a quick note on China, they have a goal to get 50% of their population out of poverty by 2050. And in order to do that, they would require 4 to 7 planet Earths if we were all to consume, if China was all to consume the way we do. So it's not just that we're having a population boom, we're also having the numbers of those who are joining the consumptive class. So China adopted the law for the promotion of the circular economy in 2009. And that is, you know, we think, well, how does that affect us? It very directly affects us because China hit that China soared globally and said, we're not taking a lot of these materials any longer because they don't fit inside a circular economy. They're contaminated and they're low value. So it really is important that we're aware of what's going on that global international stage. Just wanted to give you also a little flavor of what's happening at a city level. So there's lots of resources and lots of, most cities in Europe and even quite a few throughout Asia have some version of a circular roadmap, circular transition plan, a framework. And there's lots of resources available and they're freely, they're on open access. So if you're interested in learning more about the circular economy, there are a lot of materials to support you learning more about how that might work at a city level. And these are some of the things that are starting to happen in other places. So you've got circular construction, you've got circular economy in particular regions. And the benefits to that is when you start having a circular economy conversation that's grounded in an economic question or narrative, it tends to get more attention than when it sits in a waste or sustainability perspective. And that's just a pragmatic approach to what I've seen, that when it's grounded in an economic conversation, there's an audience that listens in a way that they aren't quite as tuned into when you're talking about a sustainability conversation. So certainly seeing things happening in that space. Lots happening in the infrastructure space in Europe. There's lots of things around roads in particular. We're starting to see the National Emissions Reduction Plan have a whole chapter on the circular economy here in New Zealand. The Infrastructure Commission's report also has, sorry, I didn't realize these were on timers. That's my fault. The Infrastructure Commission report also has a whole 5 key focus areas, and one of them is the circular economy. So just wanted to give you a sense that there's quite a significant amount of momentum behind this shift. And in Australia, where I've spent a couple of years, they're looking at things like activation precincts, often called SAPs, special activation precincts, because they're looking at deliberately introducing circular economy principles into how these precincts might work. So creating opportunities to share material, waste and energy flows, but also recognizing that in order to do that, you have to put a positive or proactive consenting process in place so that these separate entities or separate organizations can actually facilitate that sharing of learning and knowledge, as well as the actual physical materials between each of those buildings. So much more of a coherent approach to how that's looking. And what that does is it gets people outside of their, you know, it's beyond getting outside the box, it's getting outside the building. And you need to look at what the co-location opportunities might be presented to you if you start to think of your neighboring buildings or your neighboring factories as a potential collaborator in a circular economy. And so you're certainly seeing more of that happen internationally. I wanted to talk a little bit briefly around this the building as material bank. And I was actually chatting in a session this morning about this, and people really felt that this had a lot of interesting possibilities. So this is a pilot program being run out of Europe called the Building as Material Bank Framework. And basically it's urging us to consider that the buildings that are going up now, we need to see them as the building blocks of the materials of the future. And off the back of that BAM framework, they're building what's called material passports or circularity passports. The names can at times be used interchangeably. So one of the challenges to reusing materials and you know, particularly the materials into the future, is we don't often know a lot of information about them. So think of buildings and assets we've got now. We would probably certainly reuse the remove floors, you know, the nice tiles on the roof, the sash windows. We can see the value of those materials and know how to use them again. But there's lots of materials we don't have enough information about them, so they often end up in landfill. So how do we make sure that we're not getting in our own way in the future? How do we future-proof ourselves and the information we would need in order to get those reuse at much higher value opportunities? So designing the building, putting in RFID chips, QR codes, whatever the information tool might be, in order for the architects and designers of the future to have the information they need to reuse that material. And interesting, I had a chat with a colleague of mine where we talked about, as carbon pricing gets more constrained, and then we look beyond that to biodiversity or other planetary boundaries, we might find that actually it is more cost effective to reuse these materials than the price we would pay to continue to gain them from virgin resources, where you might have a much more significant biodiversity cost to accessing that material. So it's just kind of taking the long game and making sure that we're giving ourselves the best chance possible for reusing these materials in the future. I also wanted to give an example of what can happen when we don't jump to building new, where we actually think about what have we got that could be repurposed, remodeled. I mean, some of the statistics around this are quite impressive, in that 85% of the buildings have already been built. So it's not that we're going to build necessarily all new buildings where we get to start from scratch. We need to figure out how to get the best value out of the existing assets that we've got. And this is a case study on the Australian Circular Economy Hub website for Quay Quarter Tower in Sydney, where they got not just really good environmental outcomes for the way they managed that refurbishment, but actually it saved them, I think it was over $100 million in the cost of that as well. So we just need to think, not going straight to building, and actually what have we got that we can reuse, repurpose, repair. And I mentioned at the earlier slide this notion of moving away from consumption and volume to value and performance, and how that flips the business model. And here are some examples of what that looks like in play. So you've got the cities, a couple of cities in Germany. They no longer put in street lighting. They have a contract with Philips, who provide lighting as a service. So they just pay for lumens. And you're starting to see air conditioning as a service. I believe some of those examples are in Singapore. And Asia, you've got IKEA now looking at furniture as a service, and some of the ones that are a little bit more disruptive, like could you do roads as a service? Now that's just a thought paper or white paper, position paper. I don't think anyone's quite gone too far ahead in that one that I'm aware of, but I could be wrong. But there is certainly circular facades. So what that does, when you have a performance or a value that you're paying for and not an asset or a product, it flips the model on its head, because what they're seeking is a long-term relationship that is about selling you the performance of that asset, which is lighting, if it's lighting as a service. And we're also seeing it in cases like Rolls-Royce. Rolls-Royce no longer sell their engines to airlines, they charge by the mile. And in all of those models, what it does is it incentivizes investment in high quality material, minimal maintenance, modular repairability, long extended life of assets. And that stops the throughput and the pushing of volume and consumption through the system, because they're not trying to sell you another thing in 10, 15, 20 years. So it really starts to upend what we consider value, and certainly seeing that business model innovation. I mean, all of us would be familiar with, those of us of a certain age would have bought CDs and DVDs when we were wanting to listen to music or watch videos, but now we have streaming. So it's dematerializing the way we consume services. That's reducing the ecological footprint on the natural world by reducing the volume of materials required. I just wanted to give a sense of what's happening in the built environment sector. So position papers, circular economy discussion papers, lots of materials right down to the level of quantity surveyors. I'm actually sitting on the World Green Building Council, have started a circularity accelerator, which is getting the building sector and the property sector ready for this transition to the circular economy. So I think it'll be early next year, they will release their state of the sector report, which I think will be really useful for those who are involved in all kinds of development of assets. It's not just about buildings, it's about the infrastructure required to support the transition from a certain type of city and it's certain types of transport modes, and shifting them requires a much more holistic view of what city design looks like. So we're definitely seeing that there is big momentum behind this circular economy transition for the engineering and the built environment sector in particular. And again, there's some great resources out there. This one is developed by Zero Waste Scotland, or Resource Efficient Scotland. Scotland is one of the trailblazers in the circular economy space, and I would encourage anyone to jump into their website and have a little dig at some of the resources they've got available there. But very much, in line with what I've been, talking about: design for long life, designing out waste, design for deconstruction, adaptability, flexibility. I was at a conference a few weeks ago where somebody asked a question around, do we need to be designing for managed retreat? So we're expecting to hear more of that narrative going forward. When we don't know what we don't know about the climate models, how are we ensuring that our cities of the future are shaped to be flexible and resilient to those kind of changes and that kind of uncertainty? So certainly a circular economy approach lends itself very well to those kind of resilient models around what the design of our cities look like into the future. I wanted to give an example of a business model here from New Zealand. So this is an app called CivilShare. Somebody jokingly referred to it as Tinder for the construction industry. So it's where you match a resource that's available with somebody who might want it. And it was developed by a tradie, I believe, who was really frustrated at the amount of waste he saw on construction sites. And he said often it was virgin material. It was just, offcuts or resources that were over ordered and not used. So this is what a circular economy business model looks like in action, where you're really trying to get at the problem solving end of the spectrum, so that stuff does not end up in landfill, where we actually start to value that material in a more meaningful way. And I believe the platform has gone beyond just the materials, and now you can do a lot more of that, connecting with collaborators, learning ideas of how do you work with different kinds of materials that would enable them to have better cycling ability or cascading ability into the future. And I just wanted to mention, this is a piece of work that Tanya, who did my intro, didn't mention, that she's being an amazing collaborator for me over the last few months. And partly that's because she really forces me to get my theoretical ideas and the circular economy principles and ground them in what does it actually take to do this stuff. And I think one of Tanya's phrases would be, oh, that's all very well and good, Debbie, but how do I actually build the bridge? How do I take those principles and apply them on projects? So we've been developing this methodology over the last few months. Still very much a iterative process. We don't have all the answers, but what we have done is try to amalgamate the 3 key principles of a circular economy with other key pressure points and driving needs in New Zealand. And well, beyond New Zealand, but it looks a little bit different depending on where you would want to apply this. So for the first one, integrating cultural perspectives in New Zealand, that would absolutely be a Te Māori perspective. But we have offices in Australia where that would be a First Nations Indigenous conversation. And again, if it was in Singapore, it would look a bit different. But very much around ensuring that we learn and listen and explore other worldviews that might help us do a better job. Also wanting to make sure that what we think about or design or talk about incorporates that resilient and adaptation piece. How might we incorporate the need for those resilience and adaptation into those circular economy models or assets for the future? And then looking at creating broader socioeconomic benefits. So looking at things like, is there an opportunity here to do better in that social procurement space? Certainly in Australia, there's conversations happening around community wealth building. If we're going to develop all these new public assets, whether they're community solar or waste, is there an opportunity for the community to have a stake in that potentially? So very much a systems lens, and not separating these pieces out into silos, but finding a space for them all to have a voice at the table. So there's a lot of work in the background, a lot of tools for our staff to unpack what these might look like, and very much in the way of asking a series of questions. And I think one of the things that we've been clear and exploring with our teams is we don't have all the answers, but we're asking different questions. And linear economy has had 200 plus years to ask its questions, its reporting requirements, everything, its frameworks, its methodologies, and now we're asking different things. So very much at the early stages of exploring what that looks like for us and for us in Aotearoa. And we need to be frank and open about the conversations that need to be happening. And it's not about having all the answers, but it's about being open to collaborating with others who potentially we may see previously as competitors, but how do we lean into those spaces in between? And one of the common things about circular economy work is it often happens at the boundaries between departments, between different organizations, between one sector and another sector, between the government, the community and business and academia. So very much we need to get more comfortable with those in-between spaces, and perhaps the conversations and narratives of the past need to be flipped in order to allow that radical disruptive collaboration to happen. And that's it from me, and wanting to make sure that we leave some time for Q&A. And I just wanted to put a little note in there that note there is directly from the National Emissions Reduction Plan, where the government has clearly signalled that all of us, the private sector, local government, the community, we all need to push harder, try more, be more audacious, figure out what this thing looks like, and get on and do it collectively as a community, because we all need to move together towards a circular economy. We can't have certain sectors not wanting to take that leap, because it will be a drag on the momentum that's required for this to actually happen at scale and pace. So I've stopped sharing. That's it from me. Hopefully I was on time, Tanya. She said 30 minutes.
You did perfect there, Deb. Thank you very much. We have had one question come up in the chat, but if anybody has any other questions from Deb's presentation, please drop them in and we'll just go through those. So the first one we have is, how do you see the supplies of services like the street lighting that you spoke about really reducing the quantity of items that we're getting through there? And would that just push any additional costs onto the consumers? So looking for what, if there's any guarantees or things that we need to do to make sure that doesn't happen.
Thanks, that's a good question. One of the challenges we've mapped when we were trying to transfer, we were looking at air conditioning as a service potentially. The council owns lots of air conditioning assets. How do we take that to the market in a different way? And it does present challenges for procurement. So there's no doubt that what happened in Europe was because they recognized that some of these new business models could potentially introduce risk. How do we share that risk? Introduce costs. How do we reasonably share the costs where you're not penalizing one person or one company in the supply chain? So that's where that collaboration and that business model innovation and circular procurement models all come into play, because there's no doubt that they're thinking differently has a premium on risk. Being innovative sometimes is seen as a risk. So that's where those conversations that need to happen at the boundaries are really important, because it will stifle innovation if we're making it some one party's problem. So really good question, but it's probably, you've got right to the heart of one of the challenges, which is what is the innovation required in procurement that would really enable that to happen at scale.
Cool. And the next question, I will read this one out. It says, in the book, The Circular Economy Handbook, the concept of disruptive technologies is a core theme. How can the ideology of sustainability is the new digital be implemented in the engineering sector? And can we partner with technical sector or organisations who actually have an ability to implement their solutions?
Okay, that's a very long question.
Yeah, so I'll stop there because it's not finished.
Okay, I will have a go, and happy to answer it in more detail by email. If you put your contact details in. There's absolutely no doubt that digital has a huge part to play in the transition to a circular economy. Even take the BAM framework, for example, that will not work without capturing that information and digitizing it and turning it into a platform where that's open access for all players in the system. And that means that will probably have to be driven from a government department who hosts and manages that information for future use. We're seeing digital twins, scenario analysis tools. There's absolutely no doubt that a foundational building block for the success of a circular economy will be digital. Partly it's the business models will be digital. So, Spotify is now digital in a way that we had to buy a CD, but what else? What else needs disruption? You see it in the modeling of how do we get people out of their cars onto mode shift. So there's no problem or no challenge that our existing system has that wouldn't lend itself to a technology tool that would support it. But I think we also need to be really, really careful that we don't buy lots of tools and gadgets. There's still a huge amount of behavior change that has to happen. And one of the conversations that, is a little bit more disruptive is the reduction of consumption. We're talking about, decoupling economic growth from finite resource consumption. There is a point in time where we just need to shrink what we consume, especially those of us who live in the Western world who have very upper middle class lifestyles with, iPads and cars and TVs. And then we've got a section of the world who, can barely put a roof over their head. At some point, we're going to have to acknowledge that consumption as part of how we live needs a rethink.
Cool, thank you, Deb. And there was a comment around strengthening collaboration with advisory firms, and I totally agree that we do need to work out how do we connect with some of the other partners that we don't necessarily work with currently, but this will change. So the way we look at technology, the way we collaborate, everything will change on that. And how do we have influence? I think the way the circular economy is growing, we see it's coming through from government organisations that we will have no option to not collaborate if we actually want to stay in front of this sort of bow wave of change coming through. There's another question in here, but it actually references a Ignite Your Thinking piece, which I know I haven't read, so we might actually get back to that one. We'll type you an answer and come back, but the question was around where do we stand on biomethane and biohydrogen projects with landfill integration? So we'll come back, I think, on that one, unless you've got anything.
If Eleanor was here, I would say, Eleanor, can you step into this one? Yeah, sorry about that.
So the next one is sorry, my question's just jumped. For the conversations at the boundaries, the linear economy is so win-lose, and for the changes that are required, there will be many seeing themselves as potentially losing, whereas they were previously winners. Where do you think the leadership can come from?
That's a really good question. After spending 2 years in Australia, one of the things that struck me was, I thought people said to me, you're going to Australia, what are you going over there for? They're a coal burning nation and you're a circular economy specialist. what was fascinating to me was they absolutely recognize that they are losing in a disruption to a low carbon economy. So they recognize that there's nothing they can change about that. They might delay the inevitable, but they were not interested in delaying the inevitable. So they were looking really, really strongly at how do we very, very successful community in Newcastle and all of that coast, off the back of coal burning, coal mining. They're looking at reinventing themselves, and they could see that the circular economy was a way for them to do that. So they highly skilled technical jobs. They wanted to attract circular economy businesses into their region, and they could see that there was some transference of skill sets across those sectors. So I think where do we get the leadership from? I think we need to think about what the future requires, not what's feasible or palatable. What is, and I see a lot of forecasting, start from where we are, and an incremental improvement every year will get us to some vague point in time by some very, very far off date. And instead, what we need to do is we need to backcast. We need to say, where do we need to be in 2050, 2030? What are the things we would need to catalyze now to get there? So it flips the conversation on its head. And we all need to be responsible for challenging the leadership, whether it's of the organizations we're part of, the organizations we work for, our wider industry, whether it's Engineering New Zealand, whether it's your, go along to a meeting with your local council or councillors or whatever opportunities you have to demand that we step up. So I think we all need to be responsible. We cannot pass that leadership responsibility to somebody else. We need to demand it, but also participate in the conversations in a very open way where we acknowledge we don't have all the answers, but we're willing to ask them. We're willing to ask different questions.
And that's 100%. We're part of our framework that we've developed is around that socio-economic benefits. So it's not leaving others behind. It's actually helping them transition as well, because we know that we all have to transition in that piece. The next question, Deb, I should put a time limit on this for you. So it says, what is the biggest challenge to implementing circular economy thinking in New Zealand? And why do you think we are behind other countries? So you've got to narrow it down to a couple of minutes.
Biggest challenge. I think we are at the end of the world, and people say to me, Ireland and New Zealand have very similar type of economies, primary industries. Ireland has benefited from the pressure from the EU. So there's no doubt that all of the European countries are benefiting from that pressure from that there's a coherence at policy and funding. So they're benefiting from that. So New Zealand, because it's a little bit more isolated, hasn't felt that the conversations happening around New Zealand can be quite narrow. And so one of the things that I do when I work with clients is context mapping. Take your head up out of New Zealand. What's happening globally that you need to be aware of? Because we missed the China sword because we were not horizon scanning. I wrote my master's thesis in 2014, and one of the things I identified was China is likely to say no to lots of recycling because it doesn't fit inside a circular economy. That should have been on our radar, that big shift was happening in China, and we should have been shocked and then suddenly trying to develop waste. So I think part of that is being more open in our horizon scanning, what's happening around us globally that we need to be aware of. I think that's one thing. And the other, I think the other thing is we don't have very good mechanisms for collaborating. One of the things I experienced in Australia and when we went to the United States on our study tour was that triangle between government, academics, and business was much stronger. There was lots more conversations. There was lots more collaborating together to figure out, okay, this big disruptive thing is coming. What's your part to play and what do we need to do? And everyone put some skin in the game. I think that we could really benefit from tightening that relationship.
I know looking at, trying to deliver engineering projects that having the standards, your specifications, that procurement coming through, how are we going to do that? It requires that change at that level as well. So looking at what are our specifications that we're putting in there. At the moment, we don't necessarily have a lot of products out there that we could choose. If we were to say, no more concrete, what would that actually look like? So I think there's a bigger conversation that we need to have as an industry to go, how do we support the development of the new products that we're going to need to actually change the way we build and the way we design, and work together to try and help different either companies or contractors to come up with some other options for us.
I totally agree. And the unintended consequence of pulling a lever that the government did in New South Wales was a certain target of percentage of recycled materials in roads or projects of state significance by a certain date. That's all very well and good, but if the supply chain isn't ready, there's no way anyone can meet the target. And that's why you really need to have those conversations happening across the whole system, or you pull a lever and nobody can meet it. You're setting the system up for failure. So those are the conversations that need to be happening holistically.
The next question that we've got around small developing Pacific islands such as Samoa and Tonga are already practicing circular economy principles due to the lack of readily available resources on the island. Are you aware of any overseas funders willing to fund projects that can officially implement circular economy practices?
There's a few, it depends on which focus area. There's SPREP are doing a lot in the Pacific. They have quite a few work streams going on around improving the not just the recycling, but thinking more holistically around what industries could we create if we did something a little bit different. There's also an international NGO, the name escapes me, but I will dig it out, which helps. I think it's co-sponsored by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, which they take shipping nets or fishing nets. And there's an island in the Pacific that literally could surround itself 1,000 times with waste fishing nets. They just happen to be at that in that tidal flow, and they take all those and they manufacture. So they have created a business with the local community to tackle some of their waste challenges. So unfortunately, a lot of the focus is on waste. It's on the pain points that the Pacific are feeling on a daily basis, and some of these waste challenges are significant, and often it's waste that's not their waste. It's waste that's dumped and just flows on the tide. So part of us helping the Pacific is managing our waste flows better, and Australia has banned all kinds of waste from being shipped internationally, because in the past when we shipped stuff to Asia, it wasn't into properly managed waste facilities, so the leakage was phenomenal. The other thing is we need to be getting in front of the leakage problem by designing out waste. So while we have a responsibility to the Pacific communities, often the thing we need to change is ourselves and our own behavior that leads to that unintended consequence. So there is a website where you can see all of the NGOs and all of the things happening in Pacific. And if you drop your contact details in the chat, I'll get you that link and send it through to you.
Thank you, Deb. We've got another one here going. Do you have any recent examples of projects that engineers have been able to implement either reuse of materials or the circular economy principles to guide design and construction of projects?
There's a whole suite of case studies on the ACE Hub, which is the Australia Circular Economy Hub, and I'm pretty sure they're all open access. I mean, the one I showed was the Quay Quarter Tower, where they're deliberately looking for an opportunity not to demolish that building, but to reuse as much of the existing materials as possible. There's a lot of examples in EU because they've been doing it for longer. So there's a whole suite of case studies on the Ellen MacArthur website, on ICLEI, I'm not sure how you say that exactly. It's the councils, it's the group of councils who get together in Europe to talk about sustainability initiatives. There's so many there's so many examples out there that there's almost an example for every part of the sector. I mean, we've been building a library of case studies with Tanya and the team to show when these principles are being applied, this is what they look like. Some of them we will see things like biophilic design incorporated. Sometimes it will be a lower embodied carbon, or often it's a disruption to the model itself, where you're designing for disassembly or deconstruction. I was chatting to somebody the other day around what was it? Sets on it, movie sets as a service. So there's lots of innovation happening and lots of case studies out there. So if you're looking for one that's particular to a question you have, again, drop it in the chat and we'll find one that's most applicable to the question you have. Loads and loads of resources though.
And you'll find things like natural-based solutions. A lot of
Yep.
those actually fit within the circular economy framework. The main thing to watch out for is actually the materials. So you'll have things like rain gardens, and then we surround them in concrete, and it's not a low carbon concrete. So then you're not actually getting the benefits that we're trying to achieve. With doing a lot of research myself as a civil engineer, I've ended up going overseas more than I have in New Zealand, because there just haven't been as much examples out there. We do with the ISK that, you know, we'll use, look at material reuse, but there's not as many great examples as there is overseas. So I don't know if hopefully that helps. I've got one here around, the question's not quite finished, so hopefully I get this right. So it says around the green building has awards called LEED certificate. Is that where New Zealand infrastructure and buildings are heading, so for certification?
The LEED, I'm not an expert on LEED, but I know it's been around for quite some time, and some buildings certainly would have elements of circularity as part of that. And I think rather than getting too caught up on the accreditation, it's applying the principles. And one of the things that a circular model might apply is there an option not to build? So when you go to a standard like LEED or any other incredible, I mean, some of the standards are really amazing, but you've already made the decision to build. So you're in some cases, you're already on a path dependency. And there is a framework, the circular building toolkit, which the first principle is there a way not to build? Can you deliver this service in a way that doesn't require a new building? So I think the state of the sector report that I'm working on with the World Green Building Council is trying to explore the circularity issues, because they're a little bit different because of that difference in thinking. Is there a way to look at the existing assets and remodel, repair, refurbish, maintain, rather than looking at and I know there are some certifications for existing buildings where you can get much more. I think it's Neighbours does a lot of the efficiency and operating efficiency of the existing infrastructure, which is good. And I guess it's trying not to get over prescriptive, but try to trigger the innovation and thinking that's required, getting to that design out at the first end, at the beginning end.
We're likely to get some form of certification. What that looks like, I think, in New Zealand is yet to be decided whether we go overseas. So there's circularity. Obviously we have the Green Star and those in the different sectors. But like Deb said, the main thing is to actually just start trying and actually make a difference. We've got a question here saying designing the product is critical to manufacturing companies that transform from linear to circular. How does building design play an important role in construction? Just as a note, so to answer this, I was really intrigued. So we've been doing some renovations around the house, and we went to get some windows replaced, and we went to sort out a new kitchen. I was absolutely gobsmacked that it all had to be done by hand and not off the shelf. So everything was bespoke. There's no standardization. So getting people to come and make things, the amount of waste, because it wasn't modular, I was really, really surprised by. So I think when you're talking about products and manufacturing and that moving from linear to circular, I think that has a huge place to play is that modular building. And I know, Debbie, you've had some experience recently with conversations with Kang or around looking at the modular design and how architects, we like things that look different and stand out, but how do we line that with our thinking around that circular space?
Yeah, so we did an X-Lab sprint with Kayanga Ora and Becca and Naila Love as part of the X-Labs circular economy session that happens once a year, I think. And exactly that, we're not designing, we're not getting to the heart of the matter in some ways, which is making it as easy as possible to scale modular. And that is having a deeper think about what's going to work to get this stuff through the factory, designed to be efficient. So modular manufacturing has a lot to offer in that space, but we need to have that collaboration between the designers and the people who run the factories and the manufacturers, because we're introducing inefficiencies potentially by trying to design something that isn't scalable for on a larger scale. It's fine when you've got one-off modifications when it's a private individual, but when you're trying to do it across a whole system, you need to consider what is the ultimate outcome we're trying to achieve here. There's a really funny enough, there's a really good video if you're going on Air New Zealand anytime soon. It was around the built environment and architects and how they need to change some of the thinking. They showed a series of images to lots of university students, and about 90% of the students identified the buildings that looked nice or that they liked the look of, and the 10% were the outliers, and they were all architectural students. So whatever it is, I'm sure there's a bunch of architects here and I hope I haven't offended anyone, but it's what is it ultimately we're trying to do here? We're trying to house people, and in the lowest carbon, most sustainable, future generational perspective, which means we need to value these materials, put them up in a way that means they potentially have a second or third life. And that needs to become just as important as the aesthetics of the building itself, because otherwise we're kicking the problem to a future generation to solve, and often with far less resources that we have because of the disruption that the climate change and supply chain resilience, all of those challenges are only going to get worse if we don't do something about turning off that tap. First thing you do when the bath's overflowing, you turn off the tap. We need to do that.
And I think it's really interesting the comment around building design playing that important role in construction, and 100%, because as Deb spoke around, she's just watched a building come down in Tauranga and it's been taken with a wrecking ball pretty much. While we've managed to recycle a lot of the materials, we can't actually reuse them on anything else. So that is going into waste streams now. So that's more looking at waste minimization rather than how do you actually use that material and value that material to put it into something else. So the fact that we either have composite materials or glue things or fix them in a way that they can't be broken into their parts and reused is huge. And that's something that we really need to be mindful going forward, is when we are doing the designing of buildings or whatever the design is, how do we design it, as Deb described, around that materials for future use. So think them as they've got a dollar value and it's only going to go up in price over the next 20, 30, 40 years, and you will want to reuse them in the future. Smashing it all down and taking it and recycling it into a different product is not going to be the best value of the material. So, you have a really important role to play.
Agreed.
There's one here. Can we access the handbook for the circular economy? It was in your presentation, in your reference materials. So my understanding is this is being recorded and you'll be able to get access to the content. You'll be able to play it back, so you should be able to get a hold of the comments there. And the references in there, and the comment was well done for working on saving the planet. And the last one we have is, do you have any ideas on how we can fast track approval of new or alternative products? There are alternatives to GIB, but getting council to approve plans that use alternatives is very difficult, if not impossible.
Agree. And that's, I didn't realize that was an issue until we had the GIB challenge. Where when you say jib, it's actually I thought jib was just a thing. I didn't realize it was actually a product with a trademark. And when you say jib, you have to use jib. So totally understand that that is a challenge. But one of the things we're trying to do is work collaboratively with groups to say, these are the things that get in the way, fall into a range of categories, but the two we mapped when we really struggled to understand why our pilot projects in Australia were not going wider was procurement and specifications. So part of that challenge is working with the councils to say, this, we've got to make this go faster. We need to sit down together and figure out what is it that's going to unstick this gap in understanding, where one person says, no, it has to be that thing, and the other says, well, actually, this is just as good. So that new material space gets a lot of attention internationally, because there are some solutions out there, lots and lots of technical solutions and products. The challenge is getting them from, it's like a square peg in a round hole. We're trying to force these business models and these products into a system that was designed for something different. So really tightly specified standards and requirements. How do we create an opportunity to allow innovation to happen and share the risk potentially of certain types of materials? But sometimes it's not a risk at all. It's just getting on with the work of changing the rules to make it go faster. And one of the things that Europe had were called innovation deals, where there was European funding where you could apply to say, we are moving from linear to circular. We've got this great idea, this great product. Here are all the regulations or barriers that we're experiencing, and they would fund you to unpack those barriers. And that's the work that needs to happen in the middle that I spoke about earlier. Often it's not a product problem or a technology problem, or in some ways it's not a solution. It's the bits in between, the procurement, the regulations, the stickiness of a linear system is holding on to the past, and we need to find ways to unstick that. So one of the things Europe has 18 circular economy living labs, and that's what living labs do really well. When you've got a nutty, difficult problem that needs multiple stakeholders to move their thinking, move their timeframes, just get on with stuff. Living labs do that particularly well, because they recognize it's not necessarily a technological or solution or product challenge. It's the bits in between that are getting in the way. So we're actively trying to see what we could do in that space. So watch this space.
And on that note, Deb and I are definitely being disruptors. So what we'd love to do is hear what you're doing to be disruptive. If you've got any challenges that are out there, how do we actually all come together and really challenge our industries to work more collaboratively, to come up with new ideas and to support each other into doing something different? So feel free to reach out. We're always keen to have a chat and see where things are going. But thank you very much, Deb. Thank you for your time, and thank you very much for listening. We've really enjoyed that one. So hopefully we'll hear from you again. Thanks.
Cheers.